Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and today specifically is raising awareness of secondary breast cancer, also known as metastatic breast cancer. Charity MetUpUK have launched a campaign to try and get better treatments and support for those people diagnosed with the condition. 53-year-old Laura Ashurst is from Stokesley and is part of the campaign. And I spoke to her a little earlier.
Well, I was first diagnosed with breast cancer in September 2001. I was 34. I had a lumpectomy and 25 sessions of radiotherapy, and then I had another primary diagnosis 3 years later, age 37, and I then had a mastectomy and a reconstruction. And I thought I was clear and out of the woods and knew nothing at all about metastatic breast cancer, secondary breast cancer, and so it was a complete shock to me when I was diagnosed with the incurable form of the disease, which is what secondary breast cancer is, which means it's spread to other organs and bones within the body. And I was 40 years old, and it was 2 years off Christmas. 2 weeks off Christmas, sorry. 2 weeks off Christmas.
Oh, my word. And, I mean, going back to that first diagnosis, there you were, a mum of two young kids. I mean, that in itself must have been terrifying. But then, as you say, scroll forward a few years and to realise that you were metastatic and, you had this, secondary breast cancer, knowing that there was no cure. What goes through your mind?
Well, the initial shock of receiving a secondary breast cancer diagnosis goes back to, as well, that there are so many women who live and get through a primary diagnosis that have absolutely no awareness or understanding about what secondary breast cancer is. And that was part of the shock that I experienced, because I actually had no idea that the breathlessness that I'd been experiencing for 6 months prior to my diagnosis was anything to do with the possibility of my original primary diagnosis having spread now into my lungs. One of the issues that still exists and what we're campaigning for is that people are given the red flag symptoms, signs and symptoms of secondary breast cancer at the end of their primary breast cancer experience.
How many people does this affect then, Laura?
Okay, so that is a really important question, because part of our campaign is getting answers to that, because at this moment in time, nationally, the numbers aren't counted.
Why? They're not counted. Why?
Well, because there is a lack of data, and this is one of our campaign calls, that up and down the nation, there are very, very few trusts that count secondary breast cancer patients and submit them to the Central Cancer Database. And, of course, last week the NHS have announced that there's going to be a compulsory national audit where all trusts will have to submit the data. So when you ask how many people is this affecting, the guesstimate is that we have around 11,500 people every year who die from secondary breast cancer, and that equates to approximately 31 every day, which is another pertinent point of our campaign. And it's a guess that there's around 35,000 people living with secondary breast cancer, but those figures are not accurate, because the data, we're not being counted individually as we speak.
That is truly gobsmacking. I had no idea about that. 11,500 people die a year, 31 every day, and 35,000 approximately living with
the incurable version of the disease. And all of those people require much greater support and much more emphasis and funding and access to drugs, etc. And so there's so much awareness and so much that needs to be done to support people living with secondary breast cancer, and this is part of what we're doing.
This is where, it takes us into you being part of the MetUpUK Patients Advocacy Group. So what are you calling for? Tell us more.
So MetUpUK was started by our founder, Joe Taylor, and it's the only UK patient advocacy group who are addressing the issues affecting people living with secondary breast cancer. And the campaign this month that is being brilliantly planned and prepared is called the Darker Pink campaign, and it can be found on social media all over, because the hashtags for the whole of the month are hashtag darker pink and hashtag I stand by the 31, which is addressing that fact that 31 people die every day in the UK from the disease.
Can I ask you, Laura, what is the reality of living with this diagnosis?
The reality and the impact of living with a secondary breast cancer diagnosis is totally devastating, not only for the person concerned, but for their partners, families, children, loved ones, etc. And it's like it's living with uncertainty every day. The median survival is 2 to 3 years. That in itself is devastating. It's a devastating piece of information. But the reality of the disease is that, it's incurable. And once the disease is spread to other parts of the body, we need better access and more funding and research for drug development and quicker and speedier access to those drugs to extend that median survival rate. To be diagnosed I was aged 40. I was told I had up to 2 years to live. I have responded exceptionally well, which is not the norm. I'm coming into my 14th year of living with secondary breast cancer.
Wow.
The vast majority of people who are diagnosed with this disease do not live anywhere near as long as that. What we want is the support, the funding and the research into drug development that means more and more people have their lives extended. And it's got to start with us being counted, because none of that can take place without us knowing the exact numbers of the people that are currently living with the disease.
Please keep staying strong. Please keep staying amazing, because that's clearly what you are, and an incredible force. And if anybody is listening right now and they'd like to maybe find out more or get in touch, where do they need to go then, Laura?
Okay, 2 websites. The first website is www.metupuk.org.uk. The second website is the website that Joe Taylor founded, which is abcdiagnosis.co.uk, and that contains a wealth of information and so much really, really valid, reliable information on primary breast cancer and secondary breast cancer. And Joe was instrumental in actually designing an infographic with the red flag signs and symptoms of secondary breast cancer, and they're on there too. So they're 2 easy places to go to access so much information. And to help support us.
Scott Makin.